We picked up the solve in distress call the way you pick up most of them out past the ashfall corridor, as a footnote on a routine debris survey, half buried under 3 days of static, and a conquered traffic advisory nobody had bothered to update. My name is Owen Halsey. I run engineering aboard the Fenimore, a tender built for exactly this kind of unglamorous work, patching hulls, flushing coolant lines, doing the boring mechanical labor that keeps other people's ships in the sky. We weren't supposed to be anywhere near the corridor. We were 3 days into a debris mapping run when Priya, my second, flagged a signal repeating on an old civilian frequency nobody uses anymore because nobody's supposed to need it. It was a request for hull sealant, enough resin to close a stress fracture along a spine seam, and enough fuel to make the next waystation 90 hours out. That was the whole ask. No plea for rescue, no distress flag in the formal sense, just a supply request, filed and refiled, addressed to the Verun Concord's regional routing office, which held jurisdiction over that stretch of drift. The Concord's reply, when I finally pulled the full transcript, was 4 lines long. Convoy designated non-essential cargo class. Escort resources not allocated for non-essential transit. Advise self-repair or await scheduled resupply. Estimated arrival, unspecified. They weren't being cruel. They were being precise. A grain convoy hauling seed stock for a colony world with a failed growing season simply didn't clear the threshold for an armed escort through a corridor that ate 2 ships out of 5 that tried it without one. So the solving had been drifting for 6 days, patching what they could with what they had, filing the same modest request into a silence that had already made its decision. We changed course without waiting for authorization. That's not heroism, whatever people want to call it later. It's just what you do when you're closer than anyone else, and the alternative is finishing your survey run while a hull seam finishes failing. The convoy was 5 barges when we found them, strung together on tow lines like something out of an older century, running lights dimmed to save power. The lead vessel, the one broadcasting the request, was called the Hallow Bloom, and when we matched velocity alongside her, I got my first real look at the solvent pale gray-blue skin, still and watchful eyes built for low light, robes cut for a climate none of them had felt in months. Their convoy master met me at the seal door herself, in Havre. Steady voice, exhausted eyes, the particular stillness of someone who has stopped expecting good news and has trained herself not to show disappointment when it doesn't come. She asked, through the translator, whether we carried sealant to spare. Just that. She'd clearly rehearsed the request to take as little as possible from whoever finally answered it. I told her we'd brought the core. I don't think it landed until my technicians actually started coming through the airlock. 12 of them, full kits, followed by 2 medics from the Fenimore's tiny sickbay who'd volunteered before I'd finished asking, and then the Escort Corvette Petrel easing into formation off our port side. Because 90 more hours through the ashfall corridor with a compromised hull and no cover was not a risk I was willing to let an Havre's people carry alone, request or no request. She stood in that airlock and watched 12 people in work suits start unloading gear built to do far more than close one seam, and something in her face went very quiet. Not relief, not yet. Disbelief holding its breath. We found the real problem inside 4 hours. The stress fracture was a symptom, not the cause. Their spine frame had been flexing wrong for weeks. Ever since a debris strike nobody had properly assessed, because nobody on that convoy had a structural engineer to spare. My people regraded the load path across all 5 barges, not just the Hallow Bloom, working through what should have been ship's night and into the next watch without anyone asking them to. Halfway through the regrading, we hit a moment that could have gone badly. The Hallow Bloom's central spine had been carrying more torsional stress than her frame was rated for, and when my team released the old load path to install the new bracing, the whole barge groaned, a long, low sound that traveled through the deck plating and into your teeth. For about 4 seconds nobody said anything at all. Then the readings settled, the groan died off, and Priya said the frame had settled into its new opinion of itself. The closest anyone came to a joke all shift. And Avray watched from the corridor hatch the entire time, hands folded, and didn't leave until the readings were confirmed stable. I don't think she trusted good news until she'd watched it hold. It was Priya who found the seed vaults. She wasn't looking for them. She was routing a diagnostic line through the Hallow Bloom's aft compartments and found a bank of climate-locked storage cells running warmer than they should, their preservation coils failing in slow motion the same way the hull had been, quietly for weeks, past the point where a small crew with no spare parts could do anything but watch the numbers climb. And Avray hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't asked, because she'd stopped believing anyone would say yes to something that large. I found her in the narrow galley she used as an office and asked directly what those cells held. She answered without much inflection, the way people talk about things they've already grieved once and don't intend to grieve again in front of a stranger. Somir's growing season had failed 2 cycles running, a root blight, then a cold snap nobody had modeled, and the convoy carried what remained of the planet's seed reserve, the only version of next year Somir had left. She hadn't listed the vaults on the supply request because a request has a shape, and don't let our future die of neglect in transit doesn't fit inside it. You ask for resin. You don't ask a stranger to save a harvest. We fixed the coils anyway. It took the better part of a day, cannibalizing parts from our own spares locker that we weren't going to get back for months, and nobody on my crew treated it as an inconvenience. That's the part I keep turning over afterward. Not that we could do it, but that not one person aboard the Fenimore hesitated at the size of the ask once they understood what was actually at stake. The request had been for resin. What we found was a harvest. By the time we finished, the convoy's hull read stronger than it had probably read in a year. The seed vaults were holding steady at spec, and the petrol had run a clean sweep of the corridor ahead to confirm the route was safe for the remaining 90 hours. And Avray came to see me off at the sealed door where we'd first met. She didn't have a formal word of thanks prepared. I got the sense the Solvin don't do that kind of ceremony easily, or maybe she simply hadn't expected to need one. She asked quietly why we'd done all of it when all they'd asked for was resin. I told her the truth, which is that it's hard to look at a problem that's actually 5 problems and only fix the one somebody had the nerve to ask about. She studied that answer for a long moment, the way you'd study something you were trying to translate twice, once from our language, and once from what she'd been taught to expect from anyone at all. We didn't linger. There was no fleet review, no formal handoff, no speeches. My crew filed back through the airlock in the same tired, unhurried way they'd filed in a day and a half earlier, gear bags over their shoulders, already talking about the debris survey we still had to finish. One of the medics left a spare field kit with the Hallow Bloom's own physician, mostly because carrying it back on board felt like taking something we no longer had a reason to keep. The Petrel took up escort position at the head of the convoy, sweeping the corridor clean as she went, and the Fenimore fell in alongside for the first leg before peeling off toward our next assignment. Nobody aboard treated any of it as remarkable enough to slow down for. That's the part worth understanding. It wasn't a rescue in the way the word gets used in the reports the Conquered will eventually file. It was a shift, a long one and a hard one, and then the next job. The last thing I saw on the aft camera before we broke formation was an Avray standing at a viewport on the Hallow Bloom, watching us go, one hand flat against the glass. She didn't wave. I don't think it's a gesture her people make. But she stood there long after most people would have turned away, and I understood that for reasons that had nothing to do with etiquette and everything to do with finally believing what she was looking at. I logged the repair as routine. Hull integrity restored, escort provided, cargo preservation systems repaired incidental to primary task. 4 lines, same as the Conquered's refusal had been. I don't know if anyone will ever read mine as closely as I read theirs. The seed vaults will reach Somir with 6 weeks to spare before planting season. Nobody out here will make a ceremony of that either. That's fine. Some of the best work you do is the kind that never gets a name. It just gets a harvest the following year that somebody else gets to eat.